All right, everybody, we are going to start the plant kingdom. And so get your notes packet out, and which looks like this. Okay, I'm going to go through the PowerPoint. And so you can also pause this recording if you need to, if I go too fast and you need to write something down, and go back. Before I start, I just wanted to put up the outline again of kind of what I had on the board, just so you can understand where we are in our kind of our process here. Remember, we're talking about life, the diversity of life in Unit 4. These are the domains. These are the kingdoms. And so we've done the archaea and the eubacteria. Those are both bacteria. We've done the protist kingdom. We've done the fungi kingdom. And we are now doing the plant kingdom. We're starting this today. Eventually, we'll do them all. Okay, so going back to the plant kingdom notes, starting here in the notes with just sort of the basics. If you were paying attention, what was the domain that they are in? So they are in the eukarya domain, right? Which means they have eukaryotic cells, okay? They are in the kingdom we call plantae, but these are just the fancy, like sometimes we'll just say the plant kingdom. It's the same thing. Because they're in the eukarya domain, that means the type of cell they have is eukaryotic cells. And if you remember, if you recall, what that means is that they have a nucleus. Let's see. They have a nucleus, and they also have other membrane-bound organelles that we learned back in the beginning of the year, like Golgi, endoplasmic reticulum, etc. They are also, plants are autotrophic, which remember means they do photosynthesis. And if you remember, photosynthesis produces a sugar called glucose. If you recall, it was carbon dioxide plus water made glucose and oxygen. Okay, this is glucose. So you should have just watched the intro video, and it talked about how plants have given us oxygen. All life on Earth, we owe a lot to them because, remember, they're the beginnings of every food chain. So they make this glucose, right? They need sunlight in order to do this. They basically take carbon dioxide and water, and they make glucose, which, if you remember, we often refer to this as food. We say plants make their own food, and this becomes then the food for everything as you go down, things that eat the plant, etc., down a food chain, right? And I think I talked to you before about how there was no life on land until plants produced the oxygen, which went up into the atmosphere and made O3, which is ozone. And ozone is what blocks a lot of the UV light, so life could evolve onto land. So we owe a lot to plants, all right? So they do photosynthesis, which means they produce glucose. A lot of that is review. All plants are multicellular, meaning more than one cell, or we'll say many cells, but they're more than one. You can see them. Some of the unique things about their anatomy, I think we memorized this back when we did a plant cell. The cell walls they're made of cellulose. And if you remember, we called cellulose fiber in our diet. If you remember, I think I talked about when we call something fiber, it means we can't digest it as humans. So we call it fiber, and what that means is if you don't digest it and absorb it into your blood, it basically travels all the way from mouth to anus through your intestines, etc., and it kind of exercises. I don't know how to spell exercise. It exercises the muscles of our large intestine, otherwise known as the colon. And so we talk about fiber in our diet and how it's good for our colon. And it's basically when you eat plants and you chew them up, the cellulose becomes fiber in our diet. We don't get any calories out of it. We don't absorb it. We don't get anything from the cellulose itself, but it does exercise the muscles of our digestive system, particularly the colon, which is good. So that is a little bit of review. So they got fiber. All right, where are we here? They have chloroplasts. That's review. We did that when we did plant cells that have chlorophyll. Remember, chlorophyll is the green pigment that actually absorbs the sun, okay, that allows it to absorb the sunlight. And that chlorophyll is in the organelle called a chloroplast. And if you also remember, they have a large central vacuole. So that's a lot of that we knew already. That's kind of because we did plant cells and we did photosynthesis. So most of that should be review information. I did put in your notes, just if you want to visually remember this. This was a plant cell. Here's our large central vacuole that takes up a lot of the space in the cell. Remember, they have a cell wall made of cellulose. Just to recall, the fungi have cell walls made of chitin or chitin, however you want to say it. They have a nucleus, and then they have all these other membrane. Here's the chloroplasts. It's kind of hard to see here. Here's a chloroplasts, or the green organelles in there, and they have chlorophyll in them. And this isn't showing the other membrane-bound organelles. It's showing a mitochondria, which would be a membrane-bound organelle. But that's just kind of a review. All right. Some other basics of plants. I'm not liking the blue. I'm going to switch. So all plants evolved from green algae. And green algae are also closely related to the protists, okay? So both of green algae, so we talked about red algae and brown algae in the protist kingdom. In particular, green algae, and you can imagine green implies that it's doing photosynthesis, right? Which is what we're about to say. Both are photosynthetic. So green algae and plants are green and have chloroplast or chlorophyll to do photosynthesis, which we don't need to write that up there because there it is. Okay. The difference between green algae and plants is green algae. Let's see, we're talking particularly about green algae here. Green algae are aquatic, which means they live in the water. Whereas most of the plants we're going to be talking about now, we're going to go into the 4 phylums of the plant kingdom. Most of the plants are terrestrial that we're going to be talking about. So, which means living on land, right? Aquatic means in the water. So if you look over here, I'm not sure, I don't think I gave you this cladogram, but I'd like you to kind of draw it. So a lot of this stuff we're not going to do. We're going to just do the basic plant groups. So we're not doing hornworts or liverworts, but we are going to do mosses. We're not going to do club mosses. We're going to do ferns. We're going to do gymnosperms and angiosperms. Okay, so I'd like you to kind of draw this cladogram. If you need to pause and show green algae. And remember, when we draw these cladograms, time is kind of going up here in terms of evolution. We have a green algae ancestor, and then show mosses branching off of that, and then show ferns branching off of that, and then gymnosperms, which we're going to see are trees, like conifers that have cones, like Christmas trees. And then after that, angiosperms, which are going to be the flowering plants. So if you could just quickly draw a cladogram that has 1, 2, 3, 4, has these 5 things in it in terms of evolution. Later on, I don't know that we're going to get to all of them in today's notes, but we're going to go into each of these 4 categories. These are the main 4 categories of land plants. And we're going to go in particular, talk about each category and the characteristics of these. But I want you to know the order they evolve. So if you need to pause, you can pause. You don't need to write this information because that goes above and beyond what we're going to learn. You could leave seeds in there as a, remember we talk about those are the derived traits, because we're going to see that the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, right, basically pine trees and flowering plants, these 2 plants have seeds. So that'll come up later, but just pause and kind of draw that little cladogram to give you kind of a overview of where we're going. In general, though, we're just kind of talking about plants still in general here. Okay, so plants evolved to live on land, right? So you'll notice all of these green algae, this is in the water. And I just put some pictures of green algae here, under most of it under microscopic, and some of them you can see, but like this is a plant. But these are all water aquatic plants or microscopic green algae. Okay, so those live in the water. And all of these, you might want to actually put, these all live on, so now they're going to live on land, everything coming after the green algae. So all of these are land plants. And we're going to see that plants had to evolve adaptations to kind of deal with being on land. Land, they tend to dry out. If they reproduce by sperm that have flagella, how are they going to swim? We'll see as we go from mosses to ferns to pine trees to flowering plants and trees, more and more evolutionary adaptations to land. So let's just in general talk about some of these over here a little bit. One of the things that they all have to evolve is they all evolved roots, okay, to live on land. So it allows them to kind of anchor themselves into the soil. And if you remember, they're getting water from the soil. And we're going to be talking about minerals, which are inorganic things. So they're going to get water and minerals from the soil using their roots. They also had to evolve leaves to capture the sunlight for photosynthesis. There's a few other things they also had to evolve. They also evolved something called a waxy cuticle layer. So they're covered by a layer of wax, which helps them keep from drying out on the land. So just kind of add this on the side somewhere. So they developed a waxy, these are all adaptations to land. Let's just kind of make a little, again, I didn't make up these notes. I would have organized them a little different, but all of these things here that I've circled in a square are adaptations to land as they evolved to live on land. So they evolved roots, they evolved leaves, they evolved a waxy cuticle. And I have a picture here, it's not in your notes, but just to show you, give you a visual. This is a cross-section of a leaf. Don't worry about what a dicot is yet. So if I were looking at like the side of a leaf, and this is the top of the leaf, and this is the bottom of the leaf, what you see here, they're calling something a cuticle. That's a waxy cuticle. That's a layer of wax, and wax is waterproof. So that like all the water these are the cells in the leaf, the water isn't all evaporating out because they would dry out on land as compared to living in the water. So the waxy cuticle, like a layer, and you think about it, if you've touched a leaf or looked at a leaf or a stem, they have a, whoops, what did I do? They have a waxy, they're kind of a waxy layer. You can see it on a leaf. We're going to see they also, like another thing to adapting on land is the embryo. So they're going to have fertilization or spores. We'll talk about reproduction in a little bit. But there's going to be a little baby embryo plant, just like you were an embryo, and it develops. But it's going to develop inside of protective coating. You don't need to write that down or know that. But there's a lot more to plants adapting to land. But just know those things there. Just a couple other things. Remember, plants, this is review. They're the bottom of the food web. If you remember, they're always T1, which remember stood for trophic level 1. They're always the first thing in the food chain. They are what we call the producers, right? Everything depends on them. Most plants don't move, that we say they're non-motile. Okay. There's some, like I think in the video you saw the Venus flytrap thing that trapped the fly, so it can close its leaves, but in general they don't move. So most plants reproduce sexually as opposed to asexually. And so I want to kind of talk about what that means a little bit. So this says sperm and egg. I want you to also add pollen and egg. So sexual reproduction, when I say something reproduces sexually, what that means is there has to be a combination of two cells in order to reproduce. Okay, and usually those two cells have half the chromosomes of the species, or half the DNA. We haven't really done a lot with chromosomes yet, but so the definition of sexual reproduction is there's basically, we call that it's fertilization. There's a fertilization event, which, you can see, like an example would be in the humans, right? We have 46 chromosomes. So a human egg has 23 chromosomes. A human sperm isn't that big, but it also has 23 chromosomes. And it swims with a flagella. And so when those two go together by fertilization, we get the first cell that has 46 chromosomes in it, which is the human chromosome number. So you were at one point that one cell, which we call the zygote. I'm not going to write it down because I don't want you to memorize the word zygote. But that'll then develop into what we call an embryo. You were at once a little ball of cells. And you'll see, even in plants, we talk about an embryo. So an embryo, and these would be just a ball, all these cells it does mitosis, which we haven't done, but anyway. And then that embryo will eventually grow into like a baby or a human. So in a human example, we're an example of sexual reproduction. It means there's a combination of two things by fertilization that have half the chromosome number, so you get an organism with the actual chromosome number. So sperm and egg is one way, and we're going to see there are some of the plant groups that still had a sperm. Like, we generally think of sperm as animals. And sperm have you'll notice, right? Sperm have a flagella, and so they require kind of moisture or water to swim. So plants that reproduce with a sperm and egg are going to require still, even though they're land plants, they're going to require moisture. We're going to see with the first two groups, the mosses. Okay, the sperm requires water, basically, which, you'll see we talk about moisture in the environment. The sperm requires water or moisture to swim. And so we're going to see, if we go back to our little cladogram here, the mosses and the ferns, let me do these in a different color. The mosses and the ferns are going to reproduce using sperm and egg. And so they are kind of the earlier in evolution. You'll notice mosses and ferns tend to grow in very moist forest floor type areas. So they still require a lot of moisture for their sperm to swim to their egg. Okay, we're going to see once we get to the vascular plants, which I'll explain what vascular is here in a second. Okay, so the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, these guys are going to reproduce with, instead of sperm, we're going to have pollen and eggs. And the difference between a sperm and a pollen is a sperm has a flagella that requires moisture. Pollen is just a little granule. It still has half the chromosomes, but it tends to have little, kind of wings on the side that help it. It's going to go by wind now. It's not going to require water to get to the egg. It's going to require wind, or we'll see in flowering plants like insects to carry it. Okay, so all of these are sexual reproduction. If you have a sperm that has to fertilize an egg to reproduce, or a pollen that has to fertilize an egg that reproduce, all of these reproduce sexually with two things. So where were we? So that's where we were. Okay, so we'll get into all the groups later. Let's just go back to our generalization here. So they reproduce sexually, either by sperm and egg or pollen and egg. Many of them have a mutualistic relationship. I just talked about this in the fungi notes with a fungi called Microchiridae. We just did that in fungi, so I'm going to skip on there. That's review. Let's look at a basic plant. So we're going to get into kind of more details, like parts of a flower in particular, but just a basic plant. I believe you guys have a blank thing too. If you want to do that first, you could pause this and fill in the picture there. You guys aren't doing primary root or lateral root. That's blacked out. But look at your picture there. You can pause me here and just label the parts. We have a leaf, a bud, which grows into a leaf, the stem, and then a shoot versus the root. The shoot's above ground, the root's below ground. Okay. So if you need to pause that, I'm going to start filling in the words that go with this over here, okay, that just kind of talks about all of those parts. So the shoot part is the above ground part. The stems are going to contain something that we call vascular tissue, which we're going to get to momentarily in another slide, called xylem and phloem, that transport. Vascular means, like, whenever you hear vascular, think it means it's kind of like transporting stuff around the plant. Like our vascular system is our blood. In a plant, their vascular tissue is these tubes. They look like straws, called xylem and phloem, that are going to move up and down. They also, you guys know this already, plants have leaves, and the function of a leaf is to do photosynthesis. Okay. Food travels down to the roots. So we know the leaves, right? The leaves will make glucose, gets made here at the leaf, and then that glucose is going to travel down to the roots through something called phloem, which you don't have to put on the picture. But we're going to see phloem is going to go up and down. I might as well just say this now. Phloem is going to go up, and it's tubes that will transport glucose basically down to the roots to store, and then up to the rest of the plant when the leaves fall off. So depending on spring and fall, the phloem is bringing the glucose one way or the other. Okay. So food travels down to the roots through, well, let's write it over here, through, it's what we call phloem. PH phloem. Okay. You also might want to see, it travels down to the roots through phloem. It's going to also, and we'll see, it's going to travel up also at different times of the year. So it's kind of a misleading statement. The buds are going to grow into leaves, when I think everybody knew that. The root is what we call the part. So we have the root and the shoot. The root is the part that is below ground, that doesn't do photosynthesis because there's no light getting below ground. So the leaves are the part that do photosynthesis. We're going to see the root gets water from water and minerals. Sorry, I wanted to fix something on here. So they're not photosynthesis. They get water and minerals. Gotta fix the notes as I go along. From the soil. So roots are not just getting water. There's There's what we call minerals, if you like a visual here. Sometimes we refer to these as inorganic kind of molecules that get taken in by the roots. And it's going to travel to the leaves for photosynthesis. Now we're going to see water is going to travel through xylem, something we call xylem, and I'll make all this clear later. But if you remember, right, the leaves are doing photosynthesis, which is water plus carbon dioxide gives us glucose and oxygen. This is what's happening in a leaf, right? And so where does the water come from? Well, the water comes from the roots that have to bring it up. Where does the carbon dioxide come from? It comes from the air. We're going to see there's little holes underneath the leaf that'll bring that in. Okay, let's just get to the xylem and phloem because we're kind of talking about that. So xylem vessels, so think of them like up and down. So let me just kind of show you in the picture first. Xylem and phloem, they're like straws. They're cells that kind of are stacked on top of each other. Plant cells, remember they're kind of squarish, that sit on top of each other and form sort of a straw. So there's sort of cell walls in between that have holes in them so that stuff can flow, okay? And same thing here. It's a straw with kind of individual plant cells kind of stacked on top of each other. Xylem is one way, and when they say sap is water and minerals. In our notes, we're going to call water and minerals that are coming from the roots. So you'll notice in xylem, there's only arrows going up. Xylem only goes up. It brings water and minerals from the soil up only. Phloem, it's got a two-way flow of sap. And in this case, I don't like this picture. It's mainly talking about glucose and other organic molecules that are brought up and down at different times in the fall, in the spring, when there's leaves and when there's not leaves, and we're storing the food, which I'll get into in a second. So just remember, xylem goes up and carries that. Phloem goes up and down, carrying glucose, or sometimes it'll say other organic molecules. But remember, glucose is a type of organic molecule. So xylem, let's just put that into words real quick. These are tubes that transport water and minerals. Oh, I guess, I'm like, wait a minute. Water and minerals from the soil up only. And it's going up, obviously, if it's going up, it's going from the roots to the leaves. We're going to see capillary action. If you remember, we learned that when we learned about water movement, plays a big role in that. There's other things that make water go up, but we're going to draw the line there. Phloem, then, are tubes that transport organic nutrients, otherwise known as food, otherwise known as glucose or sugar, up and down the plant. I don't know, do you have to fill that in, or is that filled in? So here's where the difference is for phloem, whether it's going in the spring and the summer, the glucose, aka the food or the sugar, that was made in photosynthesis at the leaves, travels down to the roots to be stored for winter. So in the spring and the summer, you see glucose going down because you're making lots of extra food, and the plant is just going to store a lot of that in its roots. Think of it like you store your stuff in your basement. They're storing glucose or food in the roots in their basement for the winter. And in the winter, the leaves fall off. So in the winter, the glucose or the food will travel up from the roots to provide basically food, or energy. Remember, food's for energy, for the shoot above ground when the leaves are gone. So in the fall, in the winter, right, there's no leaves doing photosynthesis, making food. So it'll bring that food up to keep the plant sort of alive in the winter. It's not really, it's just coming up to like the shoot or the stems because the leaves are gone. I believe you're missing this sentence in your notes. So I don't know if you want to pause and just copy this sentence, okay? Because it's kind of important. This is what we refer to as vascular tissue. If a plant has xylem and phloem to move stuff up and down, it allows the plant to grow taller, kind of away from the ground, because it can conduct stuff up and down rather than just rely on diffusion from the ground. And so one of the things, I'll come back to this, but one of the things you'll notice about as we go in evolution, mosses grow really close to the ground. They don't have like true xylem and phloem. They're little. And as we get in evolution, you have ferns, and now we have like big trees, okay? So plants, as they evolved and have better vascular tissue and weren't just relying on getting water from the ground to every cell by diffusion, they started growing taller over evolution, which you can see. So let me go back to that. Okay. So make sure you write that sentence down. You can pause if you need to. I think I have, 2 more slides, not to fret. I know this is getting long. All right. In general, reproduction, we're going to talk about sort of 2 types of ways that plants reproduce. Some plants are going to reproduce. So I mentioned there's sperm and egg and there's pollen and egg. There's also going to be spores, okay? So this is confusing. Let's just kind of fill this in. So plants reproduce through either spores. I don't like the way this is organized, but let's just go with it. Spores or seeds. Okay. I'll come back to it later. Both are what we call adaptations in evolution, kind of traits that allow them to survive unfavorable conditions and also we talked about dispersal. We even talked about it with fungi. We don't want all the spores or all the seeds landing in one place and competing. We want them to disperse. They have a better chance of survival. So this is already filled in for you if you want to just pause and kind of fill this in. But spores is kind of like a plant embryo that doesn't have any protective coat on it. It's usually just like a cell. It requires moisture to stay viable. That just means alive. There's no food supply. It's in there with the embryo, which we're going to see a seed has food in it. So they contain no food supply. And they're usually small and little microscopic, like the spores we took out of the fungi, like you can barely see them, right? So over here, you see a spore is just usually kind of microscopic, like a cell. And when this spore lands somewhere, it can grow into a new organism. Seeds, okay, so here's showing you a seed. I don't know if you know that what a seed really is. If you eat a seed, like what you're eating, there's a little plant embryo in the seed. That's a little baby plant, a little teeny weeny baby embryo plant. And in a seed, along with the baby embryo plant, there's food storage. There's stuff we call the endosperm, which is basically food. Okay, so these embryos can live for a little longer because they have this protective seed coat cover on the outside. Okay. So you can imagine which one came second in evolution, which one's kind of better adapted. Seeds. So a seed is a plant embryo protected by a hard shell. These can remain dormant for years if needed because they have stored food in there. So they contain a supply of nutrients or food for the plant embryo. We're going to see seeds can either be in cones, like of pine trees, or fruits when we get to the flowering plants. This will come up later. And they're larger than spores. Okay, these are microscopic, and you can see a seed with your eyes. So that's a spore versus a seed. We'll do more with this as we go through all the different types of plants. We'll talk about when it makes spores, when it makes seeds, where are the seeds, etc. All right, this is where we're going to end today. So I just kind of want you to, we're going to look at this this is sort of like the cladogram I made you draw. These are the 4 major groups of plants, sort of listed in order here. So I just want you to take a look at the cladogram. Let's see if you can answer these questions. So here's my green algae ancestor. And if you remember a cladogram, we have time going up like that in evolution. So green algae came first. Then the mosses evolved after green algae. This is the trait that evolved, vascular tissue. And if you remember, what is vascular tissue? Not just water conducting, but let's say xylem. Let's just say conducting. Xylem and phloem evolved after the mosses. Oh shoot, there's my phone. Then ferns, then seeds, then cone-bearing plants. Oh my God. Okay. All right, then seeds evolved. Whoops. We often draw a line when we do our derived traits. Then cone-bearing plants. Okay, these are going to be like the trees, like Christmas trees, that have cones. Cones are their reproductive part. And then flowering plants. And you see the trait flowers with seeds enclosed in a fruit is a flowering plant. So just see if you can pause and answer these. And I guess we'll go ahead and fill this in. Okay, what is pictured to the left? This is what we call a cladogram. What group did all of the plants evolve from? That's the green algae. What was the first group of plants to evolve? That's the mosses. What was the last group of plants to evolve? That's the flowering plants, which we're going to have fancy names for all these. Mosses are going to be called the bryophytes, and the flowering plants are the angiosperms. But for now, we can just call them that. What characteristic do mosses not share with all the other groups? There's actually more than one. Okay. So vascular tissue. Mosses don't have vascular tissue. They don't have seeds. And they don't have flowers. And if you remember, we look at that because mosses came here, vascular tissue, seeds, and flowers all evolved after them, so they don't have them. What characteristic do cone-bearing and flowering plants have that mosses and ferns do not? The seeds. Again, this is just reading a cladogram. So anything after this is going to have seeds. Anything before it is not. And then what trait do flowering plants alone have? Okay, they have flowers. We're going to see flowers are going to turn into fruit. We're going to explain all that later. But that kind of ends where we want to end today. So you'll see the first group, the bryophytes, we will start with next class. Those are the mosses, and then we will do the ferns, then we will do the conifers. So we're going to go through each of those 4 groups kind of in detail, but let's just end there